Hi, I'm Mark, and welcome to the weekly Outside Views report on American politics. At a summit meeting of South American heads of state and government, Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva called for closer cooperation. I firmly believe that we need to reinvigorate our commitment to South American integration. That's what Lula said at Tuesday's opening in Brasilia. We have allowed ideologies to divide us and slow integration efforts. We have given up the channels of dialogue and the mechanisms of cooperation. And with that, we have lost everyone, he said. Among other things, Lula spoke out at the meeting for the introduction of a common currency in order to become more independent of the US dollar. He also advocated greater cooperation in the areas of infrastructure, environmental protection, health, energy, education, and defense. As long as we are divided, we will not turn South America into a continent that realizes its full potential, said the Brazilian president. Inclusion must be a constant goal for us all, he said. Since returning to office earlier this year, Lula has been trying to position Brazil more strongly on the international stage. His right-wing predecessor Jair Bolsonaro had largely isolated the country in terms of foreign policy. Lula has made a number of trips abroad, going to the G7 summit in Japan and mobilizing himself as a mediator in the Ukraine war. In South America, he wants to revive the Union of South American Asian Nations, or UNASUR, which has lost considerable importance due to ideological differences. But Lula also spoke about the economic consequences of Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine. We are all suffering the consequences of war. The Ukraine conflict is destabilizing the energy and fertilizer markets and leading to fluctuating food prices, which are making our living conditions worse, he said. The global supply chains are affected. They have exposed our infrastructure shortcomings and our vulnerability, he said. Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva received the authoritarian Venezuelan head of state Nicolás Maduro and backed his internationally controversial colleague from the neighboring country. I think it's the most absurd thing in the world that people who defend democracy deny that you are president of Venezuela after being elected by the people, is what Lula said after the meeting. Maduro's re-election in 2018 had been criticized by numerous countries as undemocratic. Many states, including the USA and Germany, then recognized the opposition Speaker of Parliament, Juan Guaido, as the legitimate head of state. It was Maduro's first visit to Brazil since 2015. Lula's right-wing predecessor Jair Bolsonaro had severed diplomatic ties with Venezuela. Lula resumed it shortly after taking office earlier this year. May no one ever close the door again. Brazil and Venezuela must be united now and forever, Maduro said. On Tuesday, Lula invited South American leaders to this summit I talked about earlier in Brasilia to revitalize the Union of South American Nations. The Alliance of States was founded in 2008 by Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez and Argentine President Nestor Kirchner. Because of ideological differences, the group has been largely paralyzed in recent years. UNASUR currently has neither a seat nor a general secretary. This moment is important for many reasons, but one of them is that South America has to convince itself that we have to work as one bloc. Nobody can imagine that one South American country alone can solve its problems that have been going on for more than 500 years, said Lula. On the other hand, Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva says he declined an invitation to visit Russia in a telephone conversation with Russian colleague Vladimir Putin. I thanked him for the invitation to the International Economic Forum in St. Petersburg and replied that I cannot travel to Russia at the moment. That is what Lula wrote on Twitter on Friday. However, he reaffirmed that Brazil, like India, Indonesia, and China, was ready to talk to both sides of the conflict in order to create peace. And he meant the Russian war of aggression in Ukraine. According to the Kremlin in Moscow, Lula took the initiative for the call. Putin gave his basic assessment of the development of the situation in Ukraine, according to a statement after the meeting. Russia would be open to dialogue at the political level, at least Putin was quoted as saying this. Lula has campaigned several times in recent months for international mediation in the Ukraine war involving Brazil and China. During a visit to China in April, the head of state and government of the largest country in South America caused a considerable irritation in the USA and Europe when he criticized the military aid provided by NATO and other countries to Ukraine. A few days later, he criticized Russia's attack on Ukraine, but he did not call for the withdrawal of Russian troops. And on Thursday, Lula said he spoke to Chinese head of state and party leader Xi Jinping on the phone and talked about Ukraine, among other things. But we will see how this will continue. Of course, trying to get peace is important, but Lula didn't make a very good figure here up to now, and we will see if he can improve that. But so far, I must say that was kind of a bad start. And I'll see you in my next video. I'll be back.